Hello, I'm Sean Murray, and this is The Conversation, where we take an alternative look at political events and current affairs through an Irish lens. In this show, we hope to pick, probe, investigate, and uncover the stories that you want to hear. We go where mainstream won't go. This week, I'll be speaking to a man that has dedicated his academic career to the experiences of the Irish diaspora in England during the conflict. At its height, the fraught relationship between the British and Irish communities saw a number of high-profile miscarriages of justice perpetuated against Irish citizens, something that today's guest will discuss in detail. But before we do, let's get a quick overview on this week's topic.
Ireland is globally renowned for its diaspora. Most notable are the Irish immigrants that provided the labour for thriving Western economies in the United States, Canada, Australia, and our nearest neighbour, Britain. Whether it was the 10,000 Irishmen that built the Transcontinental Railroad in the US or the famous Donegal tunnel taggers that constructed the many underground tunnels around Britain, many of whom died under horrific conditions, the Irish have, for the most part, assimilated and been welcomed with open arms by their host countries. However, there were notable exceptions. During the IRA's English bombing operations in the 1970s, a sea change in public opinion, shaped by a ferocious media campaign, unearthed old stereotypes of the past. In the aftermath of the Birmingham Pub Bombings that killed 21 people, the Prevention of Terrorism Act was introduced by the British government. This legislation provided widespread cover for many miscarriages of justice, most notably the imprisonment of the Birmingham 6, Guilford 4 and Maguire 7. In the case of the Birmingham trials, 6 Irishmen were each sentenced to life imprisonment in 1975 following their false convictions for the 1974 Birmingham Pub Bombings. Their convictions were declared unsafe and unsatisfactory and quashed by the Court of Appeal on the 14th of March 1991. Similarly, in the case of the Guilford 4 and Maguire 7, 11 people, mostly Irish, were wrongly convicted in 1975 and 1976 for the Guilford pub bombings in October 1974 and the Woolwich pub bombing a month later. All the convictions were eventually quashed after long campaigns for justice, and the cases, along with those of the Birmingham 6, diminished public confidence in the integrity of the English criminal justice system. 5 decades later, and the label of suspect community has fallen on the Muslim population of Britain. The deployment of negative stereotyping, intelligence profiling and wrongful arrest are just some of the many abuses of power being applied by government agencies with convenient cover from broadcast media. Islamophobia is being augmented by Israeli and far-right US money in order to drive a wedge between communities in Britain that see the current US-Israeli genocide in Palestine as one of the great humanitarian catastrophes of our times. The destruction in Gaza and slaughter of thousands of innocents has cast a dark shadow over the US and its allies, with support for Palestinian self-determination now at an all-time high. With a multipolar world now beckoning, today's live genocide can never be forgiven. The moral argument for Israel's apartheid existence has now been lost, buried in the ashes of Khan Yunis and Rafah.
And with that, I would like to introduce my next guest. Dr. Michael Flavin is a novelist, award-winning short story writer and academic. He is Reader in Global Education at King's College London and has authorised 6 books with the 7th due out later this year. His debut novel, One Small Step, was set in the Irish community in Britain at the height of the Troubles and is also the author of academic articles on leadership and Irish republicanism, published in the journals Terrorism and Political Violence and in Small Wars and Insurgencies. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to speak about your first novel, One Small Step, that is set in one of the most volatile periods of the Troubles, but in England, and investigates the experiences of the Irish diaspora in England. Do you want to speak a bit about that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, just to put it in context of that population, I mean, there'd been waves of emigration to the British mainland from Ireland for economic purposes for a long time. My parents came over here at the back end of the 1950s because work was plentiful. You know, my father got a job as a bus driver. And there was quite an established Irish community in Birmingham where we lived at the time. We all went to Mass on Sunday and the holy days of obligation. We went to the same primary schools. You could look down the register and see Irish name after Irish name. We had the annual St. Patrick's Day parade in Birmingham city centre, which had been going since 1952. You'd walk into another kid's house and the Sacred Heart picture would be above the fireplace and the Holy Water font would be by the door. You could live as an Irish person in Britain fairly contentedly. But of course the mood music around Irishness in Britain changed first with the conflict itself at the end of the 60s, and then that accentuated when the IRA began its mainland bombing campaign around 1973-74.
You speak about that in the novel, that backlash that there was towards the Irish community. How was that experience for yourself as a child?
I think we have to accept that there's a unique case element about Birmingham, because of course it was the site of the Birmingham Pub Bombings, 21st of November 1974, coming up for its 50th anniversary, in which an IRA unit acting without authorization from higher up the chain of command left 2 bombs in 2 Birmingham pubs, which killed 21 and injured over 180. It's pretty much instantaneous. Now in my case, as a primary school child wearing my Catholic school uniform, I'm suddenly getting beatings on the way home from school, but I'm a primary school child. I haven't the faintest idea why that's happening. I mean, if we look at then other historical accounts of that period, we see that Irish workers were being sent home from work because they were at risk of attack from their colleagues. We see that people in Birmingham with Irish accents were being refused service in shops. People trying to pay with cheques drawn against Irish banks were having them refused. Market traders in Birmingham's Bullring Market refused to handle Irish goods. The backlash was real, the backlash was substantial. The Irish Centre in the Digbeth area of Birmingham got attacked. Some Catholic schools got attacked. It was like that. The sudden switch from being tolerated to being attacked as a community. And it was, of course, you understand that there was a reaction, but the nature of reactions is that they are reactionary. And, it reaches its apex then with the miscarriages of justice case. And, of course, in our case, the Birmingham 6 are right at the forefront of that. That's
something I'd like to explore. I mean, you had the Guilford 4, the Birmingham 6, the Maguire 7. How was that period? I mean, did things ease for the Irish community then, or did things become worse?
It was certainly, there's no question it was fearful. I mean, one anecdote I draw up and use in One Small Step is that we had a vinyl record at home called Songs of Irish Resistance by a guy called Hugh Traynor. And it had the kind of classics of the repertoire. It had The Boys from the Old Brigade, Nation Once Again. After the bombings, that went missing from the house. My mum and dad clearly got rid of it. They were frightened of the next knock at the door. A work colleague of my father's who did benefit dances for the families of internees, post-August 1971, there was internment without trial here in the north of Ireland. And he was taken in. The Prevention of Terrorism Act was passed a week after Birmingham. It was a scary time to be Irish in Birmingham. If you look at the Birmingham 6, I mean, there was actually 5 of them that were travelling. The 6th one had waved them off at Birmingham's New Street Station and gone back to his council house in Aston. But when the 5 who were travelling back to Belfast were stopped, they were subjected to a forensic test which indicated that 2 of them had been handling explosives. Now, for scientific knowledge standards, that test should have been repeated, but wasn't. As soon as that result was produced, they were treated appallingly badly, terrible violence. I'd recommend any of your viewers and listeners to go to Chris Mullin's book, Error of Judgment, for the fine-grained detail on this barbaric process. But 3 of them did confess to a crime they didn't do. 2 of them never confessed. And when it comes to court, there are all kinds of things that are manifestly wrong. The statements talk about taking the bombs to the pubs in plastic bags, but the test of the explosion sites shows they were in suitcases with D-handles. And the places where they say they planted the bombs are not where the bombs were. And yet, nonetheless, they get convicted on what the judge, later ennobled, calls the clearest and most overwhelming evidence I've ever heard. Now, it took a long and thankless campaign to get them out. But if we look at that, and we look at the Guilford 4, one of whom was a teenage girl and not even Irish, if we look at the conviction of Judith Ward, if we look at the Maguire 7, the youngest of those children convicted was 13 years old and scarred for life by his prison experiences. Patrick Maguire recorded in his book, My Father's Watch. I mean, this was a terrifying time to be Irish in Britain. And you had the sense that, okay, they happened to latch on to those Irishmen, but if it hadn't have been those, they'd have found others. And I think from having been quite a settled and contented and hard-working immigrant community, it became a fearful and somewhat paranoid Irish community for quite a long period of time, certainly into the 1990s.
This would have been a period when you had a lot of tradesmen building the economy of Britain at the time. I mean, if we're talking about builders, tradesmen, bricklayers, there would have been vast employment throughout Britain at the time, and obviously this would have been badly affected, but I'm sure it also had an effect on the economy at the time also. Has there been any research into that, or has it been spoke about in much detail?
It's under-acknowledged and under-researched. Yeah, I think if we look at that post-war phase in Britain, that economic reconstruction, first of all, you got all the building work, and Irish labour is central to that building work. Then if we think about the National Health Service, introduced at the back end of the 1940s, a tremendous amount of Irish people work in the National Health Service. If we look at the transport systems in Birmingham, London, Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, elsewhere, the extent to which Ireland contributes to rebuilding the British mainland in the post-World War II phase is vastly underappreciated and under-recorded, and I think there's a fascinating seam of history and social history that's yet to be fully excavated on that subject.
Yeah, and which made me think about the underground system, subways and tunnels. I mean, the vast majority of those were built by Donegal men in a small concentrated area in the Rosses beside Dunlow, the Donegal Tigers, but that's a whole episode on its own. But on that, there's something of an anathema around the slogan, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Now, there's no doubt that we had this campaign against the Irish community in England at the time. But how valid is that? I've seen online, and I've been responsible for myself for sharing images that have been photoshopped. Is that something that you experienced or seen yourself?
No, it isn't. And when you talk about you broadcast it also, I've spoken about this in other fora, and you see the virulence of the below-the-line comments that people care about this. It's become something of a shibboleth, almost a truism, that these signs were there. But if we're looking at the level of academic knowledge production, where we can triangulate evidence, see it from more than one source, establish that it's there, I regret to say we don't have it. That's not the same as saying it doesn't exist or didn't exist. But to the level of kind of proof we need, that isn't in the public domain. Now, someone who maybe came over in the 50s or 60s, late 60s, someone may have that historical artifact which demonstrates categorically that it existed. What I will say is it's certainly expressive of a truth. It was harder for black people, for Irish people, to get accommodation when they came over here. And this idea that blacks, Irish and dogs all being grouped together, well, there was plenty of things said about Irish people. I mean, a quote that I find hard, but is nonetheless, this is demonstrable. After the Brighton bomb of 1984, if you take a look at the Sunday Express of the week and afterwards, the editor, John Junior, later Sir John Junior, writes, and I quote, "Wouldn't you rather admit to being a pig than to being Irish? I am Irish. I am not a pig. Thanks for asking." So there certainly was anti-Irish prejudice, and whether that sign exists, I mean, certainly something I saw at first hand, but didn't photograph, was a park near me after the Birmingham Pub Bombings, just had large graffiti on a wall that said, "Irish kill, rubber bullets don't." Now that happens to be untrue. I think we're looking at 16 or 17 people who were killed by plastic or rubber bullets during the conflict, half of whom were children. My sense is the person responsible for the graffiti wasn't over interested in historical nuance. Whether or not the no blacks, no Irish, no dogs specifically existed, it is expressive of a broader truth that there was anti-Irish prejudice evident on the British mainland, and that certainly was accentuated, and we certainly experienced it in Birmingham.
Now, I know the difficulties between academic writing and creative writing, and it's something that's quite difficult to navigate. How have you found that yourself within your work?
It's strange because when as you say, I've got a background of writing academic books and academic articles. I teach at a university in London. It's part of my professional practice. When I started writing One Small Step, I found it by far the easiest writing project I've ever done. I mean, it sounds like an arrogant statement, but it's just an authentic one. Once I started telling the story of what it was like to be an Irish child in Birmingham at the time of the Birmingham Pub Bombings, it just flowed. My very few regrets about the process that I didn't write this book 15 years earlier, because I certainly could have done and then been on this journey that much sooner. I think a lot of academic writing is from the outside in. So if I'm writing an article for a journal, I know it has to have a literature review section where I look at what other scholars have said. I know it has to have a methodology section where I describe how I'm going about it, so other scholars could come along and replicate the work and find its faults, which is all to the good. So there's a kind of outside-in quality about academic writing, whereas I think the creative process is much more inside-out. You almost have to start on the inside and trust the instinctive truth of what you're writing. And then later, once I had the first draft of One Small Step, I went away and did the academic thing of reading everything I could find on the subject to try and make sure that it was a decent piece of work in terms of its verisimilitude as well, which is not to say I haven't used creative license in places, because I have. Where I've got to with that now is I actually think all the creative writing has loosened me up a little as an academic writer, and I've got a little more confidence to start by writing what I actually think, and then bring the academic rigor to that at some other point. So I think I'm at quite an interesting symbiotic point in my writing, where the two, which started as kind of opposite ends of a polar relationship, are coming closer together. I'd recommend it to other academics, start getting creative.
That's an interesting point you made. So in the creative end, you would write creatively, let the writing flow, and then afterwards use your academic knowledge to go back on what you've already written.
Yeah, I think that the British novelist John Fowles, who wrote The French Lieutenant's Woman, so you almost need that kind of wildness to begin with, of just getting it out there, but then you need to come in with all the editing. I mean, anyone who writes creatively, the idea that you just do this one creative splurge and then present your work to a grateful world, be willing to rethink that as a method for creative writing. I think the hard hours are once you've done that, and then you're going back over it as an editor, and you're trying to sharpen meaning, and you're trying to find results, and you send it to trusted readers who know you well enough to tell you when you're wrong. And there was I remembered in One Small Step, the first draft had an entire chapter which was the history of Britain's colonial relationship with Ireland. The first reader I showed it to gave me a very clear retort on that's not going to work in a novel. And they were right, by the way, 100%. So I think, yes, creative writing is a really fascinating process, and I think, but you do need then to be able to bring that cooler, detached rigor to turn an interesting first draft into a valuable final document.
And looking at some of your other work, you've had a keen interest in looking at leadership within the Republican movement. I mean, basically from partition onwards. Do you want to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I think leadership's a really interesting area of study, because our tendency is with leadership to think of leaders. We tend to individualize it. But I mean, the most fundamental thing we can say about leadership is that it's a social practice. You can't do it on your own. If you or I were marooned on a desert island, we could say, I am the leader, but it's a meaningless statement unless other people are there. So followership is absolutely crucial to leadership, and followership isn't passive. Leaders have to take followers with them, or they can't stay leaders. You lose your credibility. So I've been doing a lot of work in recent years around leadership as a social practice. And I'm finding that Irish republicanism, particularly over the period known as the Troubles, is really, really interesting in that regard. Because if we look at what the IRA and Sinn Féin did over that period, was to take a paramilitary body and to transform it into a political party. And to achieve that transformation while maintaining the coherence and solidity of the organisation is really remarkable, because if we look at the history of Irish republicanism, it has been prone to splits. It's the Brendan Behan joke, you put three Republicans in a room and the first item on the agenda is the split. But if we look at what Sinn Féin accomplished over the course of the Troubles, I mean, that's extraordinary to effect that transformation while maintaining organisational coherence. And one, I'm finding it very interesting to write about it. I mean, my most recent academic article in Small Wars and Insurgencies is called Was Gerry Adams a Transformational Leader? And I think even more importantly, if we look at what the organisation did and look at that academically, we can start to draw truths that we can then say, well, what can we learn from how leadership and followership were practiced in this conflict that we can usefully and productively and progressively apply to conflicts that are still with us? We really only need to take a very cursory look at the world to see that conflict is on the rise.
There was something that we had talked about earlier, which really gave me food for thought, was the Cathal Golding incident where he had brought Johnson over. And you examined the difference between, the leadership role of Cathal Golding then and in more contemporary times with Gerry Adams and bringing the Republican movement along with him. Do you want to discuss that?
Yeah, I mean, this is really where my scholarly interest comes in, is that the failure of an IRA uprising from 1956 to 1962, Operation Harvest, in the aftermath of that failure, the leader at the time, Cathal Goulding, I mean, and a thing to say about this is it's not an unreasonable conclusion to have drawn, but to look at since partition, there'd been attempts at uprisings which hadn't succeeded. So Goulding's thing was, well, there's no point thinking about armed struggle. It's not getting us anywhere. We have to take a more political pathway to this. And it's the 1960s. There's a general leftward drift in progressive thinking. So Goulding brings over Roy Johnston from the Communist Party of Great Britain, and they start to take a much more theoretically driven approach to the conflict. Now, all of this is well and good, but what it does do is detach leader from followers. Goulding is not taking followers with him. There's an edition of the United Irishmen in that phase in the 1960s which criticises the practice of saying the rosary. Now, there's one regional IRA leader, Sean McStefan, who later becomes a central figure in the formation of the Provisionals, who refuses to sell the newspaper because it's against his own religious values, and he's suspended for a period of time. But that really was an opportunity for the leadership to think, hang on, are we bringing followers with us? Because what happens then when the conflict erupts in the late 1960s, the IRA has not maintained its armaments. It has a leadership that's committed to a political pathway. And when the community looks to the IRA to defend it, it just simply doesn't have the capacity or the inclination particularly to do so, which creates internal dissension leading to the formation of the Provisionals, which is a much more action-driven organisation perceiving a need to act in the immediate moment. So I think Goulding's leadership is an interesting kind of micro case study itself of what happens when leaders don't take followers with them. And if we look at what the Provisionals did, and as it became more political, the movement was at times glacially slow. But I think that pace of movement is predicated on the understanding that, look, if you're not bringing followers with you, you're going to lose all credibility and not then have any efficacy either.
Which brings me to your further research into leadership within the INLA and IRSP. I think that's something that fascinates me, and we will be speaking to someone from the IRSP shortly on the show. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've currently got an article under consideration which looks at leadership in the IRSP and INLA. If we look at the main leadership figure in that organisation until his killing in 77, Seamus Costello, he forms the Irish Republican Socialist Party in 1974, and it's not without interest. I mean, it takes a very progressive line on women's issues, where I think it has to be acknowledged that one thing about the world of the IRA, it was very male and also very masculine. So I think there was interesting ideas coming out the IRSP, and back from right then they were arguing for electoral participation, which again we see with the IRA and Sinn Féin. You have to wait until 1986 and the decision to contest elections in the Republic and to take seats if elected. So it's not as though it didn't have an interesting political proposition to make, the IRSP. But Costello had cut his teeth in that failed campaign of 56 to 62 and then seeing Goulding's leadership afterwards. And one of the things that it seems to me had frustrated him was precisely that any operatives, any volunteers had to be answerable to that political leadership, and this was a hindrance on getting anything done. So he gave his arm wing, the INLA, a lot more autonomy so that they could actually act on operations. But that's taking a big risk, because that's a tactic, the operational. But if it's not overseen by the strategic, it just becomes diffuse and contradictory, and people might pursue personal grievances, or people might pursue self-aggrandizement or even self-enrichment. So if those operatives aren't linked to a strategy, how are you going to achieve your aims? So I understand where Costello's frustration in that 62, then as the conflict escalated, I understand where his frustration came from. But I think there was quite a strategic error made in giving so much operational autonomy to the people on the ground. And the politics got lost. And I think organisationally it degraded after that.
I'd like to talk about your latest novel, Long is the Way, which is set in March 1988, another tumultuous period of the Troubles. Do you want to speak a bit about that? Yeah,
I mean, this is a period that I find fascinating. It's a very disturbing period in the whole conflict, in that we have, first of all, the SAS killing 3 IRA active service unit volunteers in Gibraltar. It needs to be pointed out, none of them were armed at the time of their killing. And let's be clear, you don't send the SAS in if you're looking to effect a citizen's arrest. So in the aftermath of that killing at the funeral itself then, a Milltown cemetery was attacked and grenades were thrown and shots were fired and 3 further people were killed. And then a matter of a couple of days later at one of those funerals of the victims there, 2 British Army corporals accidentally drove into the funeral cortege. The mourners thought they were being attacked again, turned on the corporals and killed both of them. So it's this awful time. I remember I was an undergraduate student at the time following these news events in the mainland, and it looked like the whole thing was going to topple over the brink. You know, civil war looked a real possibility. You know, how can this be stopped? It's just getting worse. And it's a terrible time in the conflict. And yet what we know now that we didn't know then was that these back-channel negotiations that fed forward to the peace process were happening then. Father Alec Reid of the Redemptorist Order at the Clonard Monastery here in Belfast was facilitating meetings between Gerry Adams and John Hume of the SDLP. We know that conversations were happening between Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil in the Republic. So what interests me, I suppose, is this counter-narrative, because on the one level it's one of the most appalling periods in an appalling conflict, and yet there's this below the surface narrative going on, which actually becomes a component part of what becomes the peace process in the 90s. So those reverse directions of travel are what really interests me, and it's that tension. That's what I'm trying to capture in the new novel. I'm just at the back end of finessing the writing, and hopefully that'll come to publication next year.
So what are we expecting from you in the future? What have you got your eyes set on the horizon?
Okay, well, there's several projects. One, I'm working on another article about the INLA. I mean, the article I've got under consideration at the moment ends in 1992 when the Provisional IRA move against another splinter group from INLA called the IPLO, the Irish People's Liberation Organisation. But internal dissension continued to characterise the INLA thereafter. And there was an internal feud, again, resulting in deaths in the mid-1990s. And again, I want to look at that period and say, well, what was the leadership like? What was the followership like? Because I think if we can identify those failings in leadership and followership, those structural failings, we can actually draw lessons which continue to have use value and aren't just an academic project hermetically sealed in itself. I'm also developing a book proposal to look at leadership in the IRA and Sinn Féin throughout the 30 years of the conflict. There are some fantastic canonical studies and overviews of the Troubles. There are some excellent themed works on the Troubles. So I've been reading one at the moment, Thomas Leahy's book on the intelligence war throughout the conflict. But there's no study of leadership in that period. And because I think it's so critical to the transformation of the conflict, it feels like a really rich theme to explore. I'm also working on another couple of novels. One in particular, I want to revert back to looking at how the Troubles impacted in the United Kingdom. There's a case, it's pretty much forgotten now, of a guy called Kenneth Lennon, who was a special branch tout, an informant, giving information in 1974. It had got too much for him. He was having a bit of a breakdown and starting to tell people, which I think, and next thing his poor dead body was found in a lane near Gatwick Airport in 1974. And you think, well, obviously the IRA caught up with him, he was a tout therefore. But you're left thinking, scratching your head, well, the IRA didn't have that kind of infrastructure in the United Kingdom mainland in 1974. And there were question marks about who really killed this character. And I think I will dramatise that and draw it away from the historical record, which is murky anyway, and think about it in creative terms. But I think I've always felt that is if the British public knew the full extent of what went on in this conflict on what is, Britain claims, British constitutional soil, I think it would disturb the general public really to know the full extent of what's going on. And I think it's important at this stage now, when there's a risk of a rather anaesthetic narrative being constructed about the Troubles. Those of us who work academically, those of us who work creatively, I think we have to have the courage to be willing to surface uncomfortable truths, not simply for their own sake, but for the learning we can take forward. Because the Irish constitutional question is still unresolved. There have been some really interesting events happening around Ireland's future. There's a lot of pluralistic dialogue that has to draw in all the different communities. And I think if we get this right, there's lessons that can be learned that can have broader geopolitical value, and my goodness, that's needed.
Well, Michael, I could sit and talk to you all day. I'm a big fan of your research, and I'm looking forward to see what you have in the future. I want to thank you again, which is your first time, I've been told, your first time in Belfast.
It's been amazing.
Yeah, and West Belfast in particular. Yeah,
I've spent yesterday walking around. Yeah, I mean, it's personally transformational.
Well, listen, you're always welcome. You have my number. I'm hoping to see more of you in the future.
That's great. It's been a privilege to be here. Thank you.
And that does it for another week. We'd love for you to join the conversation by sharing the link to today's programme to help us grow our audience across all our social media platforms. I'd like to thank our special guest, Dr. Michael Flavin. In the meantime, the conversation will be back next week with more investigations and analysis. I'm Sean Murray. Bye for now.